Good evening, everyone. My name's John Hogbush. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, and I just want to welcome all of you here this evening. If you would, in honor of our men and women who defend our freedom around the world, please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thanks. Please be seated. I don't know how many of you were here close to 4 years ago when we first had Peter Thiel, an entrepreneur, the founder of PayPal, investor, venture capitalist, and philanthropist, speak at the Reagan Library. But his visit today is really quite special. And I say that because appearing here once is considered to be a real honor. To speak here a second time, as Peter will today, is extremely rare. It's quite an exclusive club. So mark my words, Peter, if you find yourself speaking here a third time, suffice it to say that your name might be on the auditorium. Or when Peter last spoke, it was in relation to the release of his newest book, 0 to 1. I remember his visit well because of how sorry I was to miss it. I was in the middle of a health challenge, but I vividly recall at the time it was not my treatments that had me so concerned, but rather the fact that I had to miss the remarks of someone I have greatly admired for a number of years. So today, Peter is with us again, not only because his last appearance went so well, but because, frankly, I get a do-over. I also want to note that this is Peter's appearance today is really quite unique in that this time he comes to us as the subject of, rather than the author of, a fantastic book. Who's the author? Well, indeed, joining Peter on stage is Ryan Holiday, a celebrated writer, blogger, marketing specialist, life advisor, cattle rancher, and personality, all his own, who has written a stunning treatise on what? Well, on conspiratorial justice, I would say. Now, I won't explain what I mean by that. I made it up, but no doubt when Peter joins Ryan on stage, you will quickly get a very unique first-hand account from them both. I think that will best define it. Atlantic Magazine described the subject of Ryan's book, the lawsuit known as Balea v. Gawker, as, quote, one of the most consequential lawsuits in the history of modern American media. The story behind that lawsuit, how it came about, the conspiratorial actors behind the search for justice, the strategy involved, the winners and the losers, comes together beautifully in Ryan's work. In fact, this is a book that I should have written, darn it. My envy aside, I want to not only introduce both of these talented men, I also want to congratulate Peter for having the wisdom, the courage, and the determination to see this story through to a great end. And certainly kudos to Ryan as well for his keen eye in recognizing the value of this story in the first place, as well as his ability to tell it so well. So with that, let me just say this is a remarkable book. So too are our guests today. So ladies and gentlemen, if you would, please join me in welcoming to the Reagan Library stage Mr. Peter Thiel and Mr. Ryan Holiday.
Thank you so much. Are you used to introductions like that? That was very, very nice.
It's always too flattering. It always feels like it just goes downhill from there, I know. It's always...
Yeah, maybe I should begin by apologizing for underdressing. I think one of the reasons I was attracted to becoming a writer is they told me I would never have to wear a suit. And so I thought this book came under some strange circumstances for me. It wasn't a book that I thought I would be able to write. I didn't think anyone would be able to write it. I'd written an article for the New York Observer shortly after the verdict of the lawsuit had come down, and I got an email from Peter. I'm not quite sure how he got my email, but it just said, I really liked your article. Perhaps we should get together sometime and discuss the MBTO. And then in parentheses, he said the Manhattan-based terrorist organization, which was my first insight into some of Peter's motivations and thinking in this incredible story. And then a few weeks later, I'd written an article about why people should stop watching the news, that it was all making us all miserable and upset. And after that, I got an email from Nick Denton, whose email, who I was not sure how he got my email either. But then I realized that I was probably the only person on the planet talking to these two mortal enemies at the same time, and the book was born. And so I'm very grateful to you for one, giving me the access and being so forthcoming about your motivations and your ideology, and then for coming here and talking today.
Awesome, thanks for
having me. Should we
having
get into it? Wonderful. Well, it struck me as I was preparing that it's been a little over 10 years since those first Gawker articles were written about you. Can you take us back to what your reaction was? How did that feel?
Well, Gawker was a sort of gossip website in which the writers were underpaid. They were paid by how many people they got to click on the articles, and the articles tended to, some of them were true, some were not true, some were half true, but they tended to range from irrelevant to extremely hurtful and damaging and maybe career-ending in certain cases for different people. And they had a Silicon Valley affiliate, and they were sort of going after people in the tech industry called Ballywag, and basically, some of my friends had gotten attacked by it, and then eventually they gradually sort of turned their guns onto me. So the first few pieces were not that negative, but that was part of the MO, was just to sort of build people up, yep, and then gradually tear them down. I think the first one that came out in late '07 that I really disliked was where they outed me as gay.
Peter Thiel is totally gay, people.
And this felt like just a stunning violation of privacy to me at the time. And of course it was, if you want to put this in context, these things are never done. It's never just a factual statement. So it was, you have to say, one of the things they had the sort of the comment section on their articles where the writers were encouraged to sort of write extremely nasty comments. So the short, 500 to 1,000 word article was neutral to negative, but then you'd have super mean comments. And you try to egg on your readers to write mean comments by starting by writing some mean ones yourself.
Sure.
And so then you sort of had, in the comment section it was things like, well, we don't understand why he was uncomfortable with us telling it. Maybe it's a problem with his parents, or maybe it's this thing or the other. So it's sort of it's never even a remotely neutral thing. But anyway,
yeah.
And it was really crazy from my point of view, where it felt like a punch into the stomach, because I had no connection with these people. I had never done anything bad to them. It wasn't like sometimes when people do something bad to you, there's no like some history or something. There was no history at all. So it felt sort of nihilistic, totally sociopathic, something like that.
And it affected you because you felt like you were not a public figure, because the tone, or why did it strike you as being so over the line or so nihilistic?
Well, I think it was an attempt to sort of to damage my fun, to damage me, to reputationally sort of smear me as like a crazy, strange person in one way or another, and so I think there were all these ways these things were more damaging than they looked. They had I think there were a few people I'd already seen had gone through this, where it was always hard to judge. It's like, because people, when people read gossip sites, they of course pretend that it doesn't influence them, but it influences people a great deal. And so I had a suspicion that these things have much more of an impact than you think.
So you're not necessarily just looking at the one article, but you're playing out in your mind where the arc of this.
Sure, and of course, this was the first of of many things, and of course, I wouldn't claim that I was remotely the person they victimized the most. There were sort of so many other people. There were people. I would say I was not a public figure at the time. I was sort of a moderately successful investor in Silicon Valley, and there's many other people, of course, who had an even lower profile and were sort of in an even weaker place that they went after, far more nastily. And so, one of the kinds of conversations that it ended up triggering over the next few years was this conversation. What do you do about this?
Yeah.
And basically, you can't do anything, or there's nothing natural you can do. Sort of the narrow things you can do are, well, if you complain, they'll attack you even more. So it's sort of like the psychology of a schoolyard bully, where if you say you're a bully, stop hitting me. That's not the right thing to do.
Yeah.
And then if you punch back directly, they're gonna punch back much harder. And so and this was sort of a recurrent conversation theme that I had with various friends in Silicon Valley. What do you do about it? What do you do? And the general thing was just you try to go into some fetal position and hope the beatings would stop pretty soon and that they'd move on to the next person. And that sort of was the view I had for 4 years. We sort of talked about all kinds of fanciful ideas of what one could do, but nothing. It felt like there was just nothing you could do about it.
Yeah, I found it, talking to lots of people and then being written about Gawker myself, that it's almost like being invited to join a special club that no one wants to be a member of, being written about by Gawker in this way, and that you would get, in some cases, contacted by other people who had gone through what you were going through. Did you find that after the first articles about you, and maybe when you'd made some of your first public comments, that you began to hear from other people who were worse victims?
There were quite a few different people. I'll tell the stories without giving away the names. So one person, they'd sort of gone through his personal life. He was convinced that he would have gotten a Nobel Peace Prize, but for Gawker. Now, it wasn't clear that was true, but he was really upset. There was another, a venture capitalist who felt that that he wasn't able to say anything in Silicon Valley to put any ideas into circulation, because anyone who had strange ideas was especially ripe scapegoat and sort of an easy person to target. But yeah, there were sort of all sorts of conversations like this. There were a number of people in the media who actually felt this very strongly. So even though, and because the disproportionate number of their targets were other people in the media, generally people who were more successful than them. So it was all this sort of like incredible jealousy, resentment, tearing down people who are a little bit better than you. And so there's an especially large amount of vitriol was directed at various media people, and a number of them, over the years would then encourage me to do more than just sit by.
Well, obviously, you've said that one of your motivations was about the protection of privacy, and I think we should talk about the difference between public and private in a second. But the criticism of you, or one of the pushbacks from, I guess, the people who came to see what you did as being a form of bullying in and of itself, was that you were actually interested in protecting your business interests. And I'm just curious how much of that played into your. Were you thinking about this violated my personal privacy about my sexual orientation, or were you concerned that this sort of spotlight accurately or inaccurately would be pointed at your business interests in a way that'd be?
Well, I certainly think the privacy violations were extremely bad. Should never have done that. I think there were other things that were damaging in other ways. But and again, maybe I'm wrong about my motives here, but I sincerely don't think it was about revenge or retributive justice for any of those sorts of things. And because the damage had been done.
Okay.
Whatever damage had been done. Nothing I could do about that. It was more about specific deterrence. It was that they weren't going to hurt other people or myself even more in the future. And so the worry was much more, this is just going to keep going, and whatever damage they've done to me, they've done, but it's going to be much more damaging to other people in the future. And that's that's why I thought it was important to try to do something.
It's always interesting talking to you, and I've gotten to spend a good amount of time with Peter. I'm not sure that if I was interviewing someone else, they would be questioning their own motives I'm always interested in the way that you sort of step back and analyze what you're doing. Has that been a lifelong habit for you?
I'm always like probably a little bit too self-reflective on things, but no. Look, I think there probably were a number of different factors that came together in doing it. The big one was just that I'd seen them, hurt a lot of people, and I thought they were going to hurt a lot more.
Why is that privacy so important to you? Like, why is the sexuality of a semi-public figure worth protecting? What does privacy mean to you?
Well, privacy. I think it is implicit in the Fourth Amendment. So we have a First Amendment that people in the media always like to talk about. We also have a Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure, not just by government actors, but certainly also by private actors. And if you had a society without any privacy at all, that would be a frightening society. It would be a totalitarian society. It would be sort of like, I don't know, it's like the East German movie about the Stasi in East Germany, The Lives of Others, where everyone's spying on everybody else, and that's an incredibly screwed up place. I don't think, and then I do think that if we look under people under an electron microscope, you will find a lot of different faults. If you look closely enough, you will find a mote in the other person's eye, or something like that. And I think these things, they never work in some sort of equal way. It's always sort of somewhat. It's not like we can have a mutual thing where we're going to say we're all getting rid of privacy together. We're all going to get rid of it. Everybody will know everything about everybody, and it'll be sort of our society will be incandescently illuminated, and there'll be no secrets left, and that'll be. Everything will be perfectly transparent. I don't think that ever happens. I think it's always a weapon that gets used to take certain people down. I think the sociologist Elias Canetti had this line that power consists of the right not to answer questions. And so if you have to answer every question, that's a way to disempower you. And that's not the way our country's supposed to work.
And what does privacy protect? So is it in your mind the ability to be flawed or to think differently? What do we lose when we lose privacy?
I think we lose a lot of things. I think in some sense we lose our freedom. We lose our ability to think. We lose I think you end up. I think in practice it always means you're going to be subject to some sort of destructive process.
Right.
It's never just a sort of a neutral thing like that.
How do you balance that tension then with, two of the companies you're most publicly associated with have both privacy issues, but then are inherently about taking data, which would maybe otherwise be private, and using it to some public end?
Well,
I'm talking about Facebook and Palantir.
Yeah, so I have to always be careful, what I say in these things. So there's a on the Facebook side, this certainly is one of the things that's controversial about the company, and we need to, and there is sort of this question about where the right balance gets struck. Now, in the case of Facebook, it is the users themselves that put all the information out there, and maybe they don't know what they're doing or there's something wrong with it, but it is voluntary. So I do think there's a very big difference between things that are voluntary versus things that are not. I think that in the case of Palantir, which is sort of a national security context, so you're trying to identify terrorists, and so what kind of stuff can we know about people to identify terrorists? And you have all kinds of protections on that. And the way I would position Palantir as a pro-privacy company is that the high-tech solution is that you find very targeted ways to get information about people. The low-tech solution is you get all the information about everybody. So if you don't have any technology, you end up with a sort of a sweeping low-tech solution. Think about like sort of the low-tech airport security systems we have, which are, sort of very intrusive. And the goal was to actually have something that, is higher tech and less intrusive. One way I've often thought of defining technology is technology means doing more with less. And so in the context of a national security company like Palantir, it means more security with fewer privacy violations as a trade-off.
Okay.
And then the non-technological debate we have in our society is between people who are concerned about security, where it's like less privacy with more privacy violations with more security, or sort of maybe the ACLU, where you have more privacy and fewer things. But they sort of go together versus
Right.
go differently.
Yeah, no, I'm interested not necessarily just in some of the controversies about those two companies, but just the idea of if privacy is so important to why do we willingly give up so much of our privacy?
Well, I think, but again, I would just say there's a very sharp distinction between us giving it up
Sure.
versus it being taken away from people. And I think in cases where it gets taken away, that's where we should draw a bright line around that.
Got it. That makes sense. Well, let's go back to the discussion. So the articles have happened. You're talking to other people. You've been rudely introduced to this sort of new form of online media, and you talk to people and you hear over and over again, there's nothing you can do about it. That strikes me as a phrase you don't like hearing.
So I kept asking, is there
Yeah.
anything I can do about it?
Yeah.
We finally had one of the people I sort of met by chance at a speaking event. Ended up pitching me on this idea.
Yeah.
And it's referred to as Mr. A in your book.
Yes.
And basically it was that he had just finished getting a law degree, and it was sort of that we could, that there were sort of a lot of different cases we could bring on behalf of different people whose privacy had been violated. I was not that courageous. I didn't want to be the person who did it myself, but we could bring cases on behalf of various other people. There were probably a lot of great plaintiffs, and that nobody had really tried. And so there was sort of a jujitsu move where he said, it's not been done. And I realized that that's something that hadn't always been, not only had that always been told to me, it also had been told to a whole bunch of other people. And because everybody had been told that there was nothing you could do, nobody had tried to do anything. And paradoxically, that might mean that there might be a surprising amount you could do if you just tried.
Speaking of violating someone's privacy, I did hear a rumor that Mr. A was in the audience. Is that true?
He is in the audience tonight.
There you go. That's all we'll say.
Hidden in plain sight. He's hidden in plain sight.
But to go to this idea of there's nothing you can do about it, your friend and colleague Eric Weinstein talks about the idea of a high agency individual, how sort of that life is defined by how we respond to there's nothing you can do about it. And it strikes me that that's what an entrepreneur does, right? Is basically someone thinks there isn't an opportunity and an entrepreneur goes and finds it. Did you see this as was part of what attracted you to doing something here that it was a challenge that no one thought you could do?
That was probably part. It was a whole bunch of things that came together. That was probably part of it. But I think a lot of it was I felt something had to be done.
Yeah.
And I did. The line Mr. A had was, if you don't do it, nobody will, or if everybody thinks that it won't happen, and then I at least thought we should hire some lawyers and start some sort of process and see what would come up.
What do you feel like that sense of agency is on the increase or the decline these days? Like, I'm curious where you think it sort of breaks down generationally or culturally. Is America the country where we dive into problems like that, or are we the country that says there's nothing you can do about it?
I would say historically America was the country where you did things like this. It was a place where you did new things. It was the frontier country, and you think of the frontier as a place where there's sort of a maximal amount of agency, and there probably are all sorts of ways in which I think it's been, eroded some over, over recent decades, and it would be complicated to sort of say, why that is.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think, one of the things, a very different kind of context. I've often spoken out against the education bubble and the hyper-tracking in our school system, and that's sort of, in some ways, the opposite of agencies. If everybody does the same thing,
Sure.
that's sort of a lack of agency. The question I start 0 to 1 with is, tell me something you believe that's true that nobody agrees with you on. And that's, so you have to have there's intellectual agency. There's, and things like this are the spark that makes us do great new things.
And it is interesting to me that we, the sort of the current sort of libel defamation standard in this country, the idea that you can only sue a media outlet for libel if it's sort of deliberate malice. It's not like that precedent goes back to 1787, right? That precedent is only from the late 60s.
Yeah, and of course, the actual malice standard, the New York Times v. Sullivan case, I think it was 1964.
Yeah.
Is basically, that's only for public figures. And you could also say it's not actually been that well defined what a public figure is.
Right.
And I'm not sure, I'm not sure I would have counted as a public figure in 2007. And certainly many of the people that they went after were not public figures by any reasonable stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and to me, the central issue of what you did here, and again, people can.
But we were, by the way, we were very careful not to bring a libel case. And so, we thought it was very important to go after the things, the aspects of Gawker that were uniquely sociopathic, and we didn't want there to be all this solidarity with the rest of the media, and so that's why my one mandate was it could not be libel cases. It had to be something else, and so we went after privacy violations. We looked at intellectual property theft. We looked at sort of all sorts of different kinds of cases. But we looked at the interns who weren't being paid minimum wage laws. We tried to bring that case in front of a liberal judge in Manhattan. Got some traction. And so there were sort of all these different labor law violations, IP violations, privacy violations. You look at a range of very different things.
And what I mean by that is that you just the precedents have to be set by someone at some time, right? And that you said, well, why not set a new precedent, or why not come up with new areas where precedent could be set? I think that's what's interesting.
Certainly, like in the case that we ended up becoming the motor of your book was the Terry Bollea case, where I don't know if you want me or you to say something about it. So this was Terry Bollea, also known as Hulk Hogan, and there's sort of a crazy backstory to the case, but basically. That sort of involved a sex tape of him and his best friend's wife. These are sort of like not great facts. Mm-hmm. That his best friend had secretly tape recorded the two of them doing it, and then years later, the sex tape somehow made its way to Gawker, and it got posted on Gawker in 2012.
Yes.
And then, of course, there's a lot more crazy
it's
details.
It's even weirder than that. Yes.
All these crazy things we can go into. But basically, and that was sort of one of the cases we brought where it was, and then the question would be, is a sex tape speech?
Yes.
Or is it just a privacy violation?
Right.
And this is something I think is very far from political speech or other kinds of speech, and much closer to the Fourth Amendment, much less close to the First Amendment. The one-liner I've had on this is just that, if you think of a pornographer as someone who makes sex tapes of people and pays them, and then what the Gawker people were saying was that a journalist was someone who made sex tapes and published them without asking people for permission or even much less paying them.
Sure.
And so that is a real insult to journalists to say that they're much worse than pornographers. And that was the implicit argument that Gawker made.
And a jury found that very compelling.
Well, in a jury trial, you're supposed to always argue. You argue the facts, not the law. So they screwed things up so massively in the trial. I mean, it took about 4 years to get to trial in early 2016. But they basically, they sort of argued, we're journalists and there's a First Amendment, and therefore we get to do whatever we want. And we said, this isn't speech. It's just a sex tape. It's just outrageous. And you sort of went through the specific facts, and that's what drove it.
And
you know, you know, we can debate what the breadth of what it stands for, but I think I do think there have been a lot fewer sex tapes posted since the ruling came down. So it at least stands for that proposition.
sure, and you can't find the Terry Bollea tape. If you wanted to, it's very hard to find online.
I think that's sort of down.
Yeah. So I'm curious, you set out what I defined in the book as sort of a conspiracy. You said these people shouldn't be doing what they're doing. Everyone says I can't do something about it. I'm going to do something about it. And you end up being successful. We can flash forward to that some of that later. But what did you learn about that as a methodology? Not just using the legal system, but what did you didn't buy an ad in the New York Times, a full-page ad in the New York Times where you laid out your case. You didn't hire lobbyists to go to Congress to get a law passed. You sort of tried to secretly do something through the legal system. I'm curious what you found about that methodology.
Well, it's you know, conspiracy is your word, not mine. So let's just be.
I think I got it from you, but okay.
Let's be careful on that.
Yeah.
But I would say that it's, you know, it is something that is done in all sorts of cases where, you know, you bring litigation, you know, and people fund litigation on behalf of other people for all sorts of different kinds of reasons. I think you know, there was a sense that the secrecy would help us in all sorts of ways. It probably also complicated things tremendously because you had to have, you know, all these different compartments of people. So there was we ended up going with a law firm in Los Angeles because we figured that if we went in New York, where Gawker was based, they'd learn too much because everyone talked in Manhattan. And then if we did it in Silicon Valley, it would be traced back to me. And we thought there were probably a lot of sort of high-profile celebrity-type people who would be, who might, if anyone suspected someone was behind it, there'd be so many suspects in LA, you'd have no idea who it was. Okay. But then, you know, so you had to manage the law firm in Los Angeles. You had to, you know, Mr. A, only the top two people in the law firm knew Mr. A's identity. And then, you know, Terry Bollea did not know who was behind it, and so it was sort of you had to have all these things it was pretty complicated to keep all these compartments separate.
Yeah, but I mean,
you know, I think one of the advantages of it certainly was that once, you know, there is a certain advantage where if you get to an actual, if the other people's not expecting it, there's something you do that's not the expected move. And so there are two pro wrestling terms that I learned in this whole process. So one of them is kayfabe, K-A-Y-F-A-B-E, and that means something looks real but is fake, as in all of pro wrestling. Everything's kayfabe. And then a second term, very rare, is a shoot, S-H-O-O-T. And it's like if you're the designated commie Muslim wrestler who always loses, it's possible that one day on live TV, something will snap and you will decide to just win. And so a shoot is when things become real.
Yeah,
and
when a real fight breaks out.
And there's always a chance that things can become real. And one of the messages I relayed to Hulk Hogan on the eve of the trial, early 2016, was that the other side thought it was kayfabe. They thought it was all a theatrical production, and it was actually going to be a shoot. We were going to go to trial, and we were going to win. And I think they sincerely didn't even think we were going to go to trial even the day before. They thought, of course, it's all just theater. It's all going to settle. They're just trying to get a larger amount, and you know, we were going to go till we won.
Well, talking to people who are close to Nick, one of the reasons that they gave for why he didn't suspect what was going on, or if he did suspect it, he didn't verbalize it, was that he didn't want to be seen as believing in conspiracy theories.
Yeah. I mean, it would have, you know, if he sort of spoke to all the Gawker people a few months before this trial and said, you know, I'm convinced that we're the victim of a giant conspiracy and something. I mean, you'd probably just get taken to the insane asylum or something like that. You know, there was sort of an early, you know, there were sort of various chinks in this. So, one that came up during the trial one reporter who was covering the trial in Tampa, Florida, got wind that something like this was going on. I guess there were sort of people from the Terry Bollea legal team that were talking about it, and then wrote an article. Is a Gawker hater secretly funding the lawsuit?
Yeah.
And then had sort of a whole analysis. But
they guessed it.
But the bottom line is they'd been told it, more or less. But then I was talking to Mr. A. We had sort of an emergency phone call. And it was, wow, the game's just about up. We can't let this come out beforehand. And then, it got covered on Reddit. Every news article goes on Reddit. There's some sort of Reddit thread. Yeah. And the Reddit thread, if you went through it, every single person just attacked the writer, where it was like, this is ridiculous. This is a pathetic conspiracy theory. This is, it's like asking who's behind it is like asking which hater killed Mr. Burns and The Simpsons, and so it was actually pretty inconceivable. I mean, I certainly made the mistake on the other side where, one of them, I bragged about it to way too many people. This was such a cool thing to do, and I felt I had to talk to people about it, and it was sort of selective in 2014, 2015. And then but probably by the eve of the trial, I'd probably told 20 people, and it's amazing that it hadn't come out already in retrospect. And it was just people either didn't believe me, or they, so there was this sort of thing where the idea was audacious in a way that gave us a surprisingly large amount of cover.
Are there, in the circles that you run in now, both politically and financially, would you say there's more conspiracies happening behind the scenes than people would think, or fewer?
That's hard to fully assess. I think there are not that many.
Yeah.
But it's often I think it's often a good. The conspiracy question is often a good question to ask.
What's that?
So the non-conspiracy question is what causes something. The conspiratorial question is who caused something to happen.
Okay.
And I think that can often be a very generative question, even if the specific theories are wrong. So if you ask, who was behind, who else was involved in the Oswald assassination of JFK, that's the conspiratorial question.
Sure.
And then you get sort of answers like, well, it was organized labor, it was the mafia, it was the CIA, it was the Cubans.
The Onion article says it was all of them together.
Maybe all of them. I've heard, one of my former colleagues had sort of a theory where he connected them all in a very powerful way. But what all those things tell you is something about the reality, the underbelly of American life in the early 60s that was very important and was not fully thought through. In fact, the mob was bigger than people realized, and there were all these crazy unions that were sort of fighting for support between JFK and LBJ, and there's all these different things going on. The CIA was kind of out of control.
It's interesting to me. Obviously, you spent a considerable amount of money on this particular venture, but there are many people in today's world that could have afforded to spend something like that on a project like this, right?
So I think the main thing that deters people is they think they can't do it.
Okay.
So it's just a self-fulfilling thing. Probably one of the early indications that we were that we had the question was, how does one assess the probabilities of success? How likely is it that something's going to work? I would say one of the early indications on this was when we did the deposition of Nick Denton, the Gawker owner / publisher, in mid-2013. So it was about a year in. And we through discovery, we had found there were 3,000 people who had written letters of complaint to Gawker of one sort or another, threatened them with legal action, et cetera, et cetera. So first question to Mr. Denton was, have you ever appeared in a court of law? Answer, no.
First question in every deposition, basically.
Yeah, that's typical first. And then second question, have you ever been deposed? Answer, no. And at that point, we knew that we'd gotten further than the other 3,000 people. And so we were already in uncharted territory. And so that's an amazing commentary on the lack of agency in our society, that even if you had the site that had maybe $250,000 to a million or whatever posts attacking, mostly attacking people, many erroneous,
Many of them rich, powerful.
As I think one of the Gawker people did, we occasionally accidentally practiced journalism. It was just something that accidentally happened. Most of the time it wasn't even at that level.
Yeah.
And nobody had even gotten to a deposition. And a deposition is something you can normally, that's just a mechanical thing. You sue someone, you can normally get to a deposition. And it hadn't, that was a big indicator that chances were going to be better than we thought.
Yeah, because I think people have this fantasy that rich people or billionaires, once they get there, they're going to be moving the levers of power around because they can do so. But it sounds like maybe that happens less than people think. And is that because is there something about wealth that makes you think, like, does wealth make you more conservative, less conservative? I don't mean politically, I mean risk averse.
Well, it's hard to. I think that there's always any action that involves agency of the sort we're talking about. You have to want to do something that other people haven't done or that has not been done before, and there's always a question: who's advising you? How do you come across the kinds of ideas? And we have an awful lot of things in our society that tell people you can't do things, certain things don't work, you shouldn't even try. This is probably like the main way, the main way politics works in our society is that you're going to lose, don't try to win. And we try to sort of interfere with people's agency. We try to demotivate them, and so if you don't let that sort of social control, that sort of interference operate, you can do a lot.
You're famously labeled a contrarian, which you've pushed back on when I've mentioned it before. I think you see yourself more. A contrarian is simply reacting against what other people think, right?
Yeah, you don't want to just put a minus sign in front of consensus.
Okay.
And I think that the truly contrarian thing is to think for yourself. I do think there are a lot of times when consensus is wrong in all sorts of weird ways. It's always this question. Malcolm Gladwell has a book, The Wisdom of Crowds. And I think one always has to contrast this with the madness of crowds. And the question is, when is the crowd wise and when is it insane? And this is sort of like, and so there's sort of all sorts of versions of this, but I tend to think that the crowd is more often insane than wise. It's actually the way Malcolm Gladwell goes through it is a crowd is wise if we had like a jelly. Large glass with jelly beans in it. We're trying to figure out how many jelly beans there were in it. And we took a survey and everybody thought of it an independent number. Then the average number from the crowd would actually be pretty good.
Yeah.
And so it works when people make independent decisions.
Okay.
And when the decisions are derivative, when I'm doing what other people in the crowd are doing, that's when no one thinks for themselves, and that's when the crowd is unusually wrong. And so the question you have to ask is how often do you have a crowd of people where people are thinking for themselves, and how often do you have one where it simply becomes sort of this mob of one sort or another? And my judgment would be it's much more often the latter than the former.
How have you cultivated the ability or maintained the ability, given your success and the circles that you're in? How do you maintain that ability to think for yourself? What do you have? Do you have secrets? Do you have tips? Like, if someone is trying to step out of groupthink, what should they do?
You try not to be too beholden to fashion. It's hard to say what the formula for that is, but I am always keenly aware of how much pressure I'm under to do this, how much pressure we're all under. Sort of the autobiographical thing I always like to tell is, I was in the super tract thing where, in 8th grade, one of my friends said, I know you're going to get into Stanford in 4 years, and then 4 years later I got into Stanford, and I got into Stanford Law School, and then I ended up at a big, prestigious law firm in Manhattan, and from the outside it was a place where everybody wanted to get in, on the inside it was a place where everybody wanted to get out, and so when I left after 7 months and 3 days, one of the people down the hall said, it's amazing you can escape from Alcatraz, and the only thing you had to do was go out the front door and not come back, but it was somehow, we're like mentally way too driven by by the things we've done, the people around us, and all these sort of crazy forms of peer pressure.
Gawker saw itself as the outsider of the media business, the sort of free thinkers, the ones who would say things that other people wouldn't say.
My version of that would be that it was exactly the opposite. That it was basically, it was, and this is sort of one of the most insidious parts of the internet. But it was basically the hate factory in action, and it was a scapegoating machine in which you got the writer and readers to gang up on one person after another, and the people they targeted were targeted in some ways at random, and in some ways for being different in one way or another. And so I tend to think it was this scapegoating machine that basically pushed people towards not saying things or saying only very bland conformist things.
So your view is the cost of
that would be my analysis of how it played out.
So your view then is the cost of Gawker is not impoliteness, but that it's suppressing the kind of independent thought that you think we need to be cultivating? It's
certainly again, politeness is too kind a word.
Sure,
so it's certainly if you do these things that are that range from being hurtful to catastrophically damaging to people, people will be less comfortable to speak up in certain ways, and that's probably bad in all sorts of contexts. I've often said that I think the biggest political problem we have is the problem of political correctness. It's the inability to articulate various sorts of things, and it's not because it's not that politics is always the most important kind of a thing, but it is sort of it's a thing where you have common sense access to.
Sure.
And if you say people can't have different political opinions, you're not allowed to have an opinion that's different from that of other people. That's sort of an insane version where things go very wrong.
I'm curious where you see the line, though, because someone like Milo Yiannopoulos, whose book you blurbed, or James O'Keefe, who I know early on you'd paid some of his legal fees. Where's the line between what they're doing, what Gawker is doing, and say, just generally eye-opening but politically incorrect speech? Like, what's positive independent thinking, what's bullying, and what's... Do you get what I'm saying?
Sure. Well, it's I think you sort of know it when you see it, and so that's you have to sort of go through that. I do think that in a political context, there probably are a lot of kinds of things when questions. I don't know if you should always go after the people. I think even politicians are human beings, and there's some limit to what you should do to politicians. You probably shouldn't go after their families. I mean, there are all sorts of terrible things that happen in these contexts. But then there are all sorts of things where it's just it's done for vicarious kicks and giggles for the audience, and that's really bad. And that's really bad. Where there's no higher purpose at all. And the judgment I would have on Gawker was that it might have portrayed itself as this fighter against convention, or sort of maybe in some ways as a sort of a left-wing social justice warrior or stuff like this, but it wasn't about that at all. It was mostly just nihilistic attacks on people. That's the judgment call you'd make.
So the ideological intention has some impact on or justification for the tone and style and approach.
Yeah, if something was ideological, that would actually seem more sincere to me.
Okay.
It's at least
Sure.
motivated. There's some higher reason you're doing it.
Than just like tall poppy syndrome
I don't like you as a writer because you sold more books than I did, and I'm going to now.
I was on
attack
Gawker's list of 100 worst American writers several years ago, which I'm quite proud of.
You presumably had done better than the person who put the list together.
I would think so. So this is one of your first events in LA since you moved here. I'm curious how much the move was motivated by trying to think independently, get outside of a bubble, or do you just like the weather?
That's too LA an answer. I'm not quite there yet, but I would say that Silicon Valley, the tech industry, has is certainly prone to its share of bubble-like thinking, of mass insanity of one form or another, and there is a certain there's a judgment that I would make that there's a part of it where it's the wisdom of crowds, where it's just a network effect and everyone's in the same place, and everyone learns from everybody else. That's sort of the positive spin, and then the negative part is where it just becomes lemming-like, behavior where everyone's imitating everyone else, and this was the dot-com bubble, it was the clean tech bubble in the 2000s, and I think it's again gotten very far on that spectrum. Certainly one of the, and this was a minor factor in this, but it was one that played a role. I supported President Trump in the election in 2016, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into in doing that in a Silicon Valley context, where it was deemed to be completely unacceptable, completely beyond the pale. I thought it was the least contrarian thing I've ever done. How can it be contrarian if half the country is on one side? And then in a Silicon Valley context, it felt like the most contrarian thing that I had done. And there is, and the context is it's if you have. And the reason I think, again, politics is such an interesting tell of something being super unhealthy on these things is that in politics, there's some point where when you get to a large enough lopsided thing, something's gone wrong. So we think 51-49 democracy, the 51% is more right, 70-30, they're even more right. When it's 99-1, we assume not that the 99% are totally right, we assume you're in North Korea.
Okay.
And so again, the thing that's problematic, the unanimity in Silicon Valley in being opposed to President Trump is it's not because that's what people believe.
Yeah.
It's a liberal place. It's not that liberal. It's I had a conversation with Mark Zuckerberg the day before the election, and it was there are 15,000 people at Facebook. How many of these people do you think are going to vote for President Trump tomorrow? And he sort of thought about it for a second and said, maybe 1,000 people. And I said, well, that's a lot of people. And then he said, well, it's not that many. It's only 6 or 7%. It's a pretty liberal company. I said, well, that's still a lot of people.
Yeah.
And do you have any idea who they are? And of course, it looked like there were zero.
Yeah.
And so I think the crazy part of the dynamic is when you have this unanimity where you don't get views articulated at all. That's my judgment call is that what was true of the election has sort of become true of many other aspects of the tech ecosystem, where it's healthier to be to look in from the outside than to be caught up in the mass insanity from the inside.
I remember I emailed you the day after the election. I was sitting in the hospital. My son had just been born. I was watching the news. Not a good thing to do. It's pretty depressing, not being a Donald Trump supporter. And I said something to you about, looks like another contrarian bet paid off. And you said contrarians are, and I think you were paraphrasing something that Jeff Bezos had said. You said like contrarians are often wrong, but when they're right, they're very right. And so I'm curious, how have you thought, since you've made that bet, and now we've got some time to look at the results, how do you feel like it's going?
Well, it's been. I still support President Trump. I'm not gonna have some sort of conversion experience to support Bernie Sanders on stage here or something like that. Even though that'd be kind of dramatic. So I'm not gonna do that. I'm not gonna do that. But I think it is. Let's see what to say about it. It's amazing to me how polarized things are, and how people have not been able to come to terms with it. I think one. Let me say one thing about the tactics of the election. It was a close election. There were a lot of but for X, Hillary Clinton would have won. So but for her rapist husband, Hillary Clinton would have won. But for the Goldman Sachs speeches, Hillary Clinton would have won.
Yeah.
But for the ridiculous email server, Hillary Clinton would have won. Now the but for thesis that I like I like to stress the most was but for the political correctness that caused people to lie to pollsters and therefore distorted the Hillary Clinton analysis of the election, she would have been able to adjust her strategy and she would have won. And I think nobody inside the Hillary campaign was, the thing somebody needed to say was, hey, look, we're intimidating people like crazy. They're not even telling the truth to pollsters, and the polls are probably not quite as good as they look, and they weren't able to have that conversation. But I think that, and I think there was sort of this hidden energy. It was unclear how big it was. I had a conversation a week before the election at my house in San Francisco, where I was a prominent Silicon Valley venture capitalist. It was a group of sort of center-right people, and he said, I'm voting for Trump next week, but because I'm in Silicon Valley, I'm lying about it. And then the question was, how do you lie? And so it was unusual.
Yeah.
It was unusual to be this honest about lying, right? So it's sort of unusual. And then the way I lie is I tell people I'm voting for Gary Johnson, the Libertarian. So you couldn't, if you said you were voting for Hillary Clinton, like your facial muscles wouldn't work, or it wouldn't work. But you could say that you were voting for Gary Johnson.
Yeah.
And then if you look at what actually happened, in the 4 weeks before the election, the Gary Johnson support went from something like 8% to 3%. It all went to Trump. And the general question you have to ask is how many of those people changed their minds at the last minute versus were lying all along,
Sure.
or were lying to themselves, which is sort of the in-between version. And so I think the political correctness was so toxic that people couldn't even get accurate polls. And that's like a extraordinary thing. And in a way, the first time that I thought President Trump had a good chance of winning was in March of 2016, when Terry Bollea won the case against Gawker. And again, I was too obsessed with this case, but the one-to-one mapping was, Donald Trump is sort of like Hulk Hogan. He's sort of this unlikely hero who's taking on.
Hogan ran for president in the 90s as well.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Trump is taking on the media, and then Hogan is taking on the Manhattan-based terrorist organization known as Gawker, and then you have the jury. It was sort of like the voters, and Gawker did not. They thought maybe it'll be bad, maybe it'll be good, but it was catastrophic. And it's the day you get the jury verdict, it's sort of all over. Our in the closing arguments, when we sort of asked for damages, our lawyer asked the jury to give, and Mr. Harder, he felt this was the largest amount he could ask with a straight face. Said, we'd like $100 million in damages for the sex tape. And then after 7 hours of deliberation, the jury came back and awarded $115 million. And that was sort of when I thought, I have these vaguely similar resonant dynamics are at work in this whole country, and it's possible it'll be as dramatic a surprise on November 2016 as it was in that courthouse in Tampa.
I have one last quick political question, then one final question, then maybe we can look at some audience questions real briefly. But did you think electing an outsider, a controversial figure like Donald Trump, I alone can fix it, did you think more would get done, or are you surprised by sort of how stalemated or resistant things have been?
Well, I thought that I did think that the solutions for the problems in our country are no longer to be found within some sort of very narrow, politically correct window that's sort of defined by maybe Hillary Clinton to Jeb Bush or something like that, which was sort of and that the solutions were going to be somewhere outside the box. I thought that, and I'd met many of the other Republican politician candidates in 2015, 2016, and a lot of them felt just like zombies. It was just sort of, it was just nothing out of the box, nothing dynamic, and I thought that, the first step was you needed someone who identified various problems and talked about them, and we probably disagree about this, but I think in all sorts of very powerful ways, I think President Trump has been, make America great again. That's a shocking truth that the country's not as great as it used to be. That's a shocking truth to be able to articulate. And the first step to solving problems is to articulate them in ways that they haven't been. I think that's been quite powerful.
So last question. So there's one of my favorite quotes from the book, from you, not from me, is you said something. This was around the time you were thinking. It was an interview you'd given then. Around the time you were sort of working on this sort of Gawker conspiracy, as I call it. You were saying that most of the things you think about or you're working on, it's not that people think that you're wrong. It's that they're not even thinking about it. So it's not even contrarian in the sense that it's a reaction, it's just something people aren't even considering. I wondered if, in sort of the last questions for me in terms of closing, is there anything you're thinking about or that we're not thinking about or that you think people should be thinking more about?
Oh boy, that's
without giving away any of your conspiracies, I suppose.
Wow, that would be like a whole. But there are a lot of things like this. So I think I don't think that we could talk for hours about this stuff. So it's not like I think there are sort of, maybe this is like a different cut on the political correctness question. So the defense of political correctness is we have the answers, we have the truth. We don't need to ask questions anymore. And if you're asking questions, you are in error and you're wasting time. And you need to just get with the program. And so a certain amount of political correctness might make sense if we were at the end of history and we sort of knew we had all the right answers for everything. And the kind of question that's always worth asking is, how much is that true versus how much is it the case that there are all sorts of things we don't understand. I'm going to go through, all the examples always make is, it's like climate change. Is that something we can have a debate on or not? And if you think it's settled science, then you're wasting time and it's not worth having a debate. If you think it's not, then it's maybe very important to have a debate. Or maybe climate science is true, but maybe methane is a worse carbon gas than carbon dioxide, and the problem is not with people driving cars, but with eating steak. So maybe you can think of they're nuanced versions of this, but my general sense is that on questions across the board, we are more wrong than we think. We're not asking the right questions. There sort of are far more answers, outside the box, and that we need to find those answers if we're going to take our civilization to the next level. So I think, and this is again why I would say that our greatest political problem, in a sense, is this problem of political correctness, because I think we're very far from the end of history, and there's an awful lot of stuff that we need to try to figure out and do differently. So that's a little bit abstract, but that would be the motivational thing and that you can sort of do this. You can do this, and there are all these different things where you can sort of do this and sort of think about what's going on.
Do I have time for a couple audience questions, or? Okay, I don't know what that symbol means. Sorry, these aren't great. These are a little confusing. So let's close on that then. So I guess your point is, sorry guys, your point is that the big questions of our time still need exploration and thinking, and that perhaps your sort of contrarian view, or the thing you believe that other people don't believe, is that we need to continue to sort of question these, that we take too much for granted or assume is a settled and done issue.
Right, I mean, this is, you could say, this is like the educational version of the question is always, the question is how much education is just brainwashing? Mm-hmm. And, or does one's real education begin when you realize how crazy your education was? Or something like that. And that's sort of a perspective I would have very strongly. And then I think the sort of consensus center-left establishment view in this country is, we have all the answers, everything's set, and maybe there's some things that are super esoteric that you can still explore. So maybe we can figure out like some permutation of string theory, or if you study for 20 years, you get to work on some small little problem that hasn't been figured out. But I think there are a lot of big questions that are very open, and they're sort of very much in plain sight.
I think that's a great place to end. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much.